for our speakers. And in terms of the rules, each speaker will have 10 minutes, and I will ring a bell when the 8th minute will strike. And finally, we will be very happy if you can leave your video on. Okay, so I think we can start, and let me welcome Dr. Clodagh Jenkins, who is talking about employability skills in economics degrees.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. So as Sylvia said, my name's Dr. Clodagh Jenkins. I'm a Principal Teaching Fellow in the Economics Department at UCL and Associate Director of CTEL. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a project I worked on for the UK Economics Network last year, which was looking at how economics undergraduate degrees, how Economics Department tried to embed employability skills into the degrees. We did lots of different things. We did a review of the literature. We ran a survey of employers, which the Economics Network does every 2 years anyway. So we had a time series of data on that. For the first time, we ran a survey of economics departments in the UK, asking them really what were they doing around skill development. And we also ran 2 focus groups where we brought academics, students, alumni, employers all together to look at some of the results of the survey. Obviously, I've only got 10 minutes. The Economics Network website has the full report and lots of other information about the project if you are interested. Let's get this working. So one of the first things that we wanted to look at was lots of people talk about a skills gap in graduate outcomes, talk about graduates not having the skills that employers need. So we wanted to check whether this was in fact the case. And what we did was 2 things. We asked employers what their skill priorities were, and also whether they thought graduates had those skills. And it's worth emphasizing here that most of the employers who respond to the surveys are employers who are looking specifically for economics graduates. And in the survey of economics departments, we asked them to rank what skills they were prioritizing. And you can see from the table here that what employers are looking for and what departments say they're prioritizing. Top 3 skills are very similar, some variation, but very similar. But where the concern comes into play is that although departments say they're prioritizing skill development in these areas, employers still are saying, and this has been the case since the first survey was run in 2008, all the way through to our 2019 survey, that the graduates that they get don't have well-developed skills, in particular in communication, in team working and collaboration, going back to our previous discussion about whether we want to encourage or discourage collaboration. And also they have concerns that students don't have wider employability skills, mainly around the ability to learn how to learn, the ability to work by themselves, so independent self-management, but also around resilience and flexibility, which I guess future graduates will have a lot of after the COVID-19 crisis. So what we found, and it is sort of what triggered deeper analysis of what economics departments were doing, was although economics departments say they're prioritizing skills, employers still feel like they're not getting it. So that we looked at some possible explanations for this, both through the surveys, the survey comments, but also our focus group discussions were very useful for this. So one possible explanation for the gap is economics departments say they're prioritizing the skills, but actually they're not spending that much time on skill development. It's still largely about content, knowledge, and what Steffi mentioned earlier is the kind of Bloom lower grade levels of understanding. But when we started talking to economics departments and looking at the survey results, we realized that, at least from our respondents, and obviously there's a bias in the people who chose to respond to our survey, and we did get about 48% of the UK economics undergraduate degrees covered by the survey, that there was a lot going on in economics departments around skill development, some variation in the type of university, But what was clear was where there was a lot of activity, it was quite new. And in many cases was kind of at pilot stage. So maybe not so much that there's not enough being done, but it might be just too early to see the outcomes in the labour market. A second issue, which I personally think is a really important one, is when we dug into what academics actually said they were focusing on in terms of those kind of skill areas, they were quite different to what employers were looking for. So take communication as an example. Academics said they were spending a long time training students how to communicate, but when we asked how, it was very much around writing academic essays or reports in closed book exam type settings. Employers, on the other hand, were looking for students to be able to write very short, concise pieces of work, so executive summary type things, being able to present their ideas orally and in writing, and most importantly, being focused on communicating with non-expert audiences. So the prioritization within a skill area is quite different between employers and academics. Another area where this came up was in terms of data analysis. So employers were looking for the ability to find the data, maybe even to create data where you can't find the data that you're looking for, to clean it, to make charts out of it, to have good data visualization skills, and less interested in high-end econometrics techniques. Whereas the academics were seeing data analysis skills very much in terms of the theory of econometrics and statistics, and less so in the ability to actually work with data itself and to work with it quite creatively. So they're just two examples, lots more examples of this different in sort of definition of the skills. Third area was economics departments say they're prioritizing skill development and they are doing a lot, but there is a difference in terms of whether they're doing it well. And in particular, so if you take something like applying economics to the real world, what employers are looking for is that they can give a question or a problem to a student, either in the interview or when they're at work, and the student can work out, how do I solve this problem? What bits of theory, what bits of evidence do I need to solve it? That's what they mean by applying economics to the real world. When we looked closely at what economics departments were doing, it was much more about, here's your theory, here's your models, and maybe a few sentences at the end of some real world examples. So students weren't really getting the opportunity to apply economics themselves. They were just hearing about how it might get applied. Other big problem is that although there's a lot going on in UK economics departments, it tends to be driven by one or two staff in most economics departments, probably the type of people who were at this conference. Other staff tend not to get engaged in this area for two reasons. One is they might be willing to do more around skill development, but they don't know what to do. So we talk about people never having left school, and that's true of a lot of our academics. So they don't really know what's needed in the workplace. So they're not sure how to develop workplace skills within their courses. The other issue, which is more important probably, is people who recognize, we're all economists, we optimize, that if they put time and effort to redesigning their course so there's more skill development, they have less time for their research. And it's their research which will get them promoted and get them other honors and other things. And the final issue seemed to be around that students didn't engage with what was offered in the first place. And then there was a sort of circular effect on staff that they got a bit despondent. So they put effort in, students didn't recognize the value of the skill development opportunities, and then lecturers wondered if it was worth their while in the first place. So of course we wanted to help people understand what they could do. So these 6 suggestions came from the literature, but also from sort of the leading economics departments who are doing best in this area. I'm going to go through these very quickly, but again, more detail in the report on the website. So the first one is really important. It works best if the senior management team make a push for it, so that it's department-led and everybody's working together. It also works best if it really is genuinely connected to workplace learning. That can be through internships and placements, but also needs to be through the type of projects they do, the type of essays they write, the audiences they write for in their work. Related to that is there's lots of evidence that students will learn the skills best in their economics curriculum. So not in a separate skills course maybe run by careers or something like that, but learning their economics and their skills together. They also need to be doing this on a regular basis. None of us learn how to present by doing it once in a 3 or 4 year degree. It needs to be continuous opportunities, as low stakes as possible in the beginning, so that they can get the opportunity to practice without having the stress of assessment on it. I already mentioned that more active learning opportunities, more genuine assessments that look like workplace learning will really help. So better teaching strategies, lots of which are consistent with best practice pedagogy anyway, the type of things that people at this conference do anyway. And the final thing, and it relates a lot to what was talked about in the plenary session and will be more important with online learning, is you have to continuously communicate with the students. You have to tell them what skills you're developing in the module, what activity is developing what skill, and why it's important that they develop that skill. So often it's important for them to do well in the course and to do well in the degree, but also it's important for their interviews, assessment centres, and for working in their future life. So that message needs to be continuously repeated. And of course, assessing the skill itself will really help them engage with it, and having good criteria around the skill, which is not easy. Which brings me to my last slide, which is none of this is easy. And the most important thing is that we learn from each other. So there are people out there who do this really well. The economics departments as a whole who do this really well seem to have set up great structures so that people share experiences with each other and share materials with each other. They also use employers and alumni really effectively. So they recognize that not every lecturer understands what it's like in the workplace, so in economic consultancy or in banking or whatever. So rather than expecting them to learn it, they bring in the expertise from employers and alumni and get their advice. The Economics Network is also developing case studies. I'm at the moment writing a guide for lecturers on how to embed skill development into module design. It was nearly written, but now I have to sort of go back through it and think about how it might apply in a virtual world as well. And of course, we all love #EconTeach, but really don't underestimate how much we can learn from each other, particularly around this idea of a lot of this is just about teaching well, teaching students to do things for themselves, to teach them to learn how to learn, to teach them to work together. If you only did that, you would be developing so many great skills amongst your students. So just to conclude, any questions, obviously in the Q&A session, but you can contact me by email or on Twitter as well. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Claude. Thank you very much for the insightful talk, and we are already receiving some questions. And next, we have Chelsea Dowell, who is presenting a research on the importance of oral communication for the business curriculum. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Can you see everything?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. So like she said, I'm Chelsea Dow. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Kentucky Wesleyan College. So I've been there, I just finished my first year there. So I'm happy to be closer to home. You see the photo, that's my nephew. So I get to spend more time with my family now. But to give you a little bit of background, my nephew's going to help me with my presentation illustrations from here on out. But I started doing some research for my previous institution. And when I was at my previous institution, they hired me to create an economics minor program. They had a few classes, but they didn't have a major, they didn't have a minor. So when I started doing my research to build a good minor program that was going to be complementary to what they already had, the economics department was in the School of Business. So I wanted to make sure it complemented the business majors they already had. So I started looking at what businesses wanted out of their new graduates. And the three main things that kept popping up in all of my research was that globally businesses wanted to hire problem-solving leaders with ethical standards who could communicate professionally. And most of our economics majors are actually graduating and going straight into the business world anyway. Only about 30% of our economics majors are going on to the research track, where closer to something like 36% are indicating they're going straight into business. But what was most interesting to me when I started doing this research was that employers weren't just saying they wanted professional communicators. They were saying that we as undergraduate institutions were not producing professional communicators. So after developing my program learning outcomes and subsequent course list, I started researching assessment methods. And when I started doing my research for assessment methods, the one that kept popping up over and over again for oral communication was formal presentations. That was the go-to best practice for our economics programs. But our employers kept coming back and saying that our graduates were insufficient at oral communication. So somewhere in there, our best practice must not have been sufficient either. So formal presentations, very important, but many new graduates are going straight into business and oftentimes into jobs where they'd never actually have to formally present. So there's a disconnect between the employers and our programs. For the most part, we can separate oral communication into three main categories. So Crossling and Ward 2002 separated into collegial interactions, supervisor interactions, and outside staff interactions. So interactions among colleagues that can be similar to what you'd think of as student interactions in a classroom with their peers. And most collegial interaction, those colleague to colleague interactions, that's what they're really seeing most of in your day-to-day work in a traditional business setting. Our economic education research, we have plenty of resources out there that promote student-to-student discussions, student-to-student interactions. And if you want a full list of citations, I can make that available upon request. But some of those can include think, pair, shares, or collaborative learning assignments, debates, etc. We've all talked about them. But those student interactions are a great jumping off point, but again, have not quite made it the full leap to meeting our employer or the students' future employers' needs. So I developed a field experiment where I looked at 3 sections of my undergraduate micro and macro classes. On the day after ad drop was over for registration, I had an unbiased neutral proctor give the students waiver and consent forms. Students were permitted to ask questions prior to consenting, and they were, if they did consent and sign the waivers, then they were sent to a computer lab and filled out a pre-survey where they ranked their oral communication skills, their formal presentation skills, and their professional colleague-to-colleague oral communication skills, choosing from 0 for very poor to 1 needs improvement, 2 neutral, 3 good, or 4 proficient. And this particular experiment was approved by the university's Human Subjects Committee, so similar to other colleges' IRBs. All students in every class, regardless of the study consent, participated in the group assignment and the rubric assessment, as long as they were present on the day that the assignment was given in class. I informed students prior to starting the assignment that their peers would be evaluating them at the conclusion of the assignment. And then the students used my original rubric that I created to critique one another on their oral communication skills. All classes received one of the group assignments and the assessment rubric to prevent adverse treatment of certain students as required by the Human Subjects Committee approval. As such, there can't be a control group comparison, but instead we looked at students completing a self-evaluation survey both before and after the treatment. After the assignment was completed by a group, all members of the group evaluated each other, and students selected 0 points, a half point, or 1 point for each of the different 5 goals that I created, which was the same as one typical homework assignment for the class, totaling at most 5 points. A student earned 0 points if he or she was not successful at meeting their goal, a half point if he or she attempted sometimes but was not always successful, so 0 for did not attempt, a half point for attempted sometimes, and then 1 point for attempted was mostly successful. Once we took all of the peer evaluations, we averaged their scores together to get 1 score total out of 5 points per student. And the grade did help to incentivize students to put forth some effort, but it was still considered low stakes because there were lots of small point assignments throughout the term. And then in the second to last week of class, students were again taken by a proctor to a computer lab and told to fill out the post survey only if they consented at the beginning of the course. And both the pre-survey and post-survey, like I said, filled out the Likert scale describing their oral communication skills. But in the post-survey, there was a few additional questions that also assessed the peer evaluation rubric itself. And just to be clear, I did not gain access to any of the data until after final grades were submitted. The class sections were relatively similar in size, time of day, demographic makeup. A small number of students in 2 of the 3 sections did not consent to participation in the study, leaving me with a total of 40 student observations who consented and were present on the day of the group activities. While undergraduate students are great at a lot of things, they don't right away see communicating with their peers as the same as communicating with colleagues. So we as instructors have to help them get there. To help them see their peers as colleagues and help them differentiate between a collegial interaction that's in a professional atmosphere and a casual friendship. So I created an original rubric to outline the structure of goals for collegial oral communication. And the goals were to actively listen, engage in professional diction and tone, respect others' opinions, clearly and concisely articulate ideas, and maintain a positive attitude. The goals were chosen based on research from SHRM, so Society for Human Resources Management, as well as my own personal teaching experiences. An explanation of each goal accompanied the written goals in the rubric, as you can see on your screen. The 5 goals together create the structure of a professional atmosphere within which all of our students can converse. So I explained the rubric's goals and explanations in class prior to passing out the assignment, and then gave students the opportunity to ask clarifying questions before we actually began. Once you see the results, you'll notice that the peer evaluators were very generous in their critiques. The lowest average score earned in any one category was a 0.8929 for professional diction and tone for section 3. Students performed the best at maintaining a positive attitude. You'll note that the study participants received perfect scores in all sections for this category. However, non-participants saw more variation, suggesting that those who did not consent may be significantly different than those who consented.
Okay, Chelsea, can I ask you to wrap up, because we are very close to the end of your time, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. We're closing in. So then the self-evals, we saw improvements from pre-treatment to post-treatment in all of the different categories. They said, yes, they did improve their oral communication skills. They did improve their colleague-to-colleague oral communication skills. They helped them better understand the goals of colleague communication, as well as improved their general oral communication skills. And then the assessment method in particular, they said improved their interactions, as well as increased their confidence in their interactions. So in conclusion, the rubric can be adapted and used with any of your group assignments that you already have in your classes. And the field experiment, while limited in size, does tend to indicate that it does improve collegial oral communication skills.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. We'll come back to some of your points during the question and answers time. Now, the last presenter is Kripa Freitas from the University of Toronto, and Kripa is going to talk about the importance of short writing for developing critical thinking abilities.
Hi, sorry, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, and thank you all for being here. And I'm super excited with this conference. It's been a lonely transition to online teaching, so it's really nice to interact with you guys. I'm going to be talking about introducing writing assignments and this is going to be based on my experience with intermediate microeconomics. However, given the shift online, I decided to kind of make this a little bit more general so we can talk about other assignments as well. Okay, so broadly, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try and convince you why writing assignments are a good idea. I'm going to talk you through design elements that I've learned through experience help, and advice on scaling up. So I teach this in a course where I have 300 students, and doing writing with 300 students in a way that's effective as well as kind of resource that minimizes resources is tough. And so I've learned some lessons over the years, which I'm happy to share. And also other lots and lots of lessons learned with experience that I think are valuable for you guys. Okay, so let's start off with kind of why writing. So I think most of us create courses because we have learning objectives that we want students to achieve. And the harder part as kind of as an instructor is to figure out how to make this learning last beyond the end of the course, right? So that they can take it, transfer it outside into upper year courses, but also potentially once they get their jobs. So transferring knowledge turns out to be something that needs to be deliberately done, and we need to kind of, as you guys know, we need to design assessments to do that, precisely because the learning literature tells us that learning is context specific, right? So if they're in your class writing assignments that you design, they have past exams, they know how to answer it, but how do we get them to do that outside? And that's kind of a big problem that kind of Clodagh brought up in her presentation. So kind of with that in mind, I want to also bring up kind of Stefania's point from earlier today, which is to say that we have these kind of learning objectives in Bloom's taxonomy about the things we want students to do, and what exactly this looks like will depend on the course that you're creating. But for a lot of us teaching, second year courses, first year courses, and also large courses, algorithmic problems turn out to be really useful ways of doing this, right? So these are problems that have one correct answer. We teach the procedure in class, and it is useful, and it helps kind of students understand what the larger concept is. But they're learning kind of how to work within a very specific narrow thing, and that becomes harder to get them to move outside, and also harder to design kind of tasks that get them to do higher order thinking skills. This is also one of the reasons for choosing algorithmic problems, is that they work well in midterm and final short term, open the test, complete it, and then kind of be done. There are many ways of building in different types of learning activities, assessments that go beyond and kind of target these higher order thinking skills. And I want to make the case that writing can help, and it's not just because of communication. So communication is important. I really want to echo Clodagh's point that employers really care about that. But to convince instructors to do that becomes a little bit harder. So we really want to make sure that we understand that we're doing this to help our students learn. Writing is a tool to help students learn, as well as learn how to be economists, right? None of them are solving algorithmic problems when they go out and work, but they are going to be doing writing. So in that sense, that's a little bit more real world to a certain extent. Writing assignments allow open-ended problems, right? So they're allowed to be curious, they're allowed to explore it independently, in depth, and more importantly, critically, right? They can see the limits of our models. When we do problem sets or questions, we kind of guide them down a very narrow path, and we don't show them all of the problems that are there with our framework. Whereas if they have to do this by themselves, then they can see it for themselves, which I think is useful. And then finally, to kind of build this idea of transferable skills, we want to have tasks that are authentic, something that they would do once they kind of graduate or go to upper year things, or just be an economist, right? And the problem is that kind of implementing this at scale with 300 students, and I'm going to try experiments of doing this in the first year with 800 students, it becomes trickier. Okay, so what I want to kind of, I guess it's going to end up reiterating what Clodagh was saying, is to just pause before I kind of speak on kind of how to implement this in scale, is to just kind of highlight some lessons I've learned by doing this. So when we first started out with this was part of an experiment, 2012, I guess, based on stuff that Clodagh was finding. Our department decided to introduce writing across the second year. So every single second year course had to have some writing, some communication skills. And then the question is, well, what do you do? How do you do it? And we just focused on the writing part. So we said, just write, just have students write, because writing is useful. But it turns out that if you just say writing, students will write, but the content is severely lacking. And part of being a good communicator is to learn how to present your content and at the depth and the things that you need. So one of the big shifts I kind of had to make, or I have made over the years of doing writing assignments, is to emphasize to students that writing is the mode of delivery, right? It's how you communicate your economics, and economics is really the focus. And so that was something I need to keep it at the back of my head when I'm designing my assessments, as well as to continually communicate to students that writing is just communication, that your economics is important. And good communication makes you communicate your economics properly. Based on this, kind of, I've started emphasizing a lot in my thought process of, how to design assessments to get at the economics, where the writing becomes part of the economics. So for me, it was kind of doing two things. One is keeping my learning objectives at the forefront of everything that I do with the writing. My learning objectives are at the forefront, and then supporting students. Initially, I would just throw students off the deep end. I would say, oh, here's the task that I want you to do, and you're going to somehow magically perform these really difficult higher order tasks. And what I've learned over the many years of doing this is to kind of supporting students, guiding students to the process, and helping them make those connections is actually crucial to the success of these assignments. So let me just give you an examples of things that I focus on when I'm designing elements. So I have two kind of important elements that I want to focus on. One is making them do critical thinking. The term critical thinking gets tossed around a lot, and it took me a long time to kind of define what exactly I was looking for when I was thinking about critical thinking. And then I ended up kind of following Brookfield, where he kind of defines it as, we want students to do two things for them to be doing critical thinking. One is the task has to be open-ended, so they can truly experience and kind of understand what those assumptions we make and link them to kind of the inferences that we make. And then finally, if they're not making an evaluative judgment at the end of your task, they're not really doing critical thinking, right? They need to say, here are all of the possible things, and this is why I'm choosing this particular end result, right? It's a recommendation or whatever it is. And so when I design a task, I kind of keep these two aspects at the forefront. And then finally, transferability. if we say we want students to be able to transfer it, so Claudia was talking about the example of an employer just gives you something on the spot and you're supposed to be able to transfer and try and answer that. It is very important that students are already practicing making connections between here's a real world situation and here's my class material. That's something that they can't do. That's something that we need to support them. And that's something that needs to be explicitly built into the writing assignments that I've learned. And this was a big kind of learning that I had to figure out, that that's what the missing gap was in my writing assignments.
Okay. Kripa, we are towards the end of your talk. If you
Okay.
can wrap up.
Sum it up in 1 minute. Okay, I just want to sum it up with here. So when you're doing this, keep your task narrow and specific. That helps you with grading and academic integrity. Okay, the more narrow it is, the more consistent it is, and the more specific it is, the less possibilities for cheating. And finally, when you're supporting students, I would just say, ask yourself how you would approach this task, and then as you're thinking about the steps that you would do it, figure out how in the process of this assignment, you can design supports for students to do this. Otherwise, your assessment is not going to be very effective. And I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to leave I have lots of stuff to say, but I'm just going to leave my email at the end. And if you want to talk more about this, or you want more examples, I'm happy to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you all our presenters for really thoughtful and inspiring presentations. To start the Q&A session, I would love to start from one comment that we had from the Zoom chat, and it was that in Colorado, the top skills that are rated by employers are communication and problem solving. I'm not sure whether this ranking was pre or post COVID, but I would love to know your opinion about whether the ranking of possible important skills would change after this crisis. This is a general question open to all of you. So, Claudia, if you want to start, maybe?
Yeah, I suppose I don't think this skill area is going to change, but the ability to communicate like this rather than in a meeting is going to be key, and that's obviously something that everybody is learning about. So you know, I guess that will be the main thing, and also probably having to learn how to work by yourself and problem solve yourself and know when to reach out to other people is going to be more key. So you know, they're not going to be sitting at a desk next to you anymore, so finding that kind of thing. But I think the underlying skill of being able to explain yourself, being able to work with other people, is core to everything. I think any role that people do. Okay, thanks. So it is the how, in your opinion, that is going to change rather than the what. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And how about you, Chelsea? Do you have
To comment more on the communication side, I would argue that we as instructors are going to have to be more diligent about giving our students authentic assessment opportunities for their oral communication skills. Because while asynchronous has many advantages, like we heard about earlier today, one thing that it struggles to do is give people the opportunity to respond in real time to each other. It's great if you have 24 hours to respond to an email and make sure that it's, you know, perfect and doesn't have a lot of emotion and it's perfectly professional. But when you're in, say, a Zoom meeting in your regular business hours and you have to respond to somebody, you don't get 24 hours. You still have to respond right away. And so I would argue that the online setting still has many technological advances that let us incorporate real-time communication. It's going to be harder to schedule, right? Have the students scheduling it on their own to make it happen. But I would argue that it's still just as important. Going online doesn't replace face-to-face communication in the real world.
Okay, thanks a lot. And Kripa, can you also tell us your ideas?
So my feeling is that the ranking is COVID is going to change the ranking for the instructors and for the departments, because at some point we're going to have to no longer be able to do these kind of tests, and we're going to have to rely on people doing collaboration explicitly, higher order thinking skills. And so I think for the department is going to get more, from a department perspective, is going to get more aligned with what the employers want. So that I think would be a good benefit of COVID, is because now we have to really think about what are we truly assessing and why is it important, which is good to do when we have an emergency, and we would not necessarily do this otherwise. I know that for me that's been something I'm thinking about a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot. And now one specific question, well, one question for each of you. I will start again with Cloda. So this was again from the Zoom chat. And do you think that this going online we are experiencing right now would help students to meet with employers in easier or more, would be easier or more difficult for students to meet with employers?
So initially I was worried it would be harder. I'm actually running some projects over the summer which require me to interview employers, and I sort of left them alone for a couple of months. But actually the experience I'm having is people are more available on Zoom or Teams than they were. So for them to come to UCL takes a lot more time than it does just to talk to people online. Also, it's worth pointing out that it's going to be a really tight labor market, and employers are really looking for the best. So they're actually planning on spending more time engaging with students to try and pull out the better students. And by better, they really are focusing on skills rather than academic knowledge now. So that's the thing that they're looking for. So I think both alumni and employers may be more easier to access online. But again, it's sort of on the behest of the instructor to find them and set it up. Our student society actually is doing a lot now, which they'd normally do in the fall as well. So they're moving early with this stuff because they don't have internships and stuff this summer happening. So they are trying to make up the time. So yeah, I think it opens up opportunities.
And will there be online fairs for employers, for example?
Yeah, so all of the things that we normally do face-to-face in the fall are moving online. I guess one of the issues will be that students are used to having a one-on-one conversation with somebody at a fair, and that will probably be harder to do. But on the flip side, I think employers are doing, I mean, so many of them are setting up virtual internships, virtual placements. I mean, they're really working hard to try and find ways to connect with the students as well. And as an ex-employer, I think people probably should remember that employers put a lot of effort into this as well. But they do rely on us to sort of share what's out there with the students.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, the question for Chelsea. We had quite a lot of curiosity about the tasks you're asking students and whether the tasks you are proposing to students are an incentive for them, represent an incentive for them to learn how to communicate better.
Sure. So I went through what group activities I already had in my curriculum set up already in the schedule, and then tried to see which of those would easily adapt into this setting. So I wasn't trying to add all new things or change my entire course structure. We're already doing all of these things. So I just wanted to figure out where it could fit in neatly. So for my micro courses, for the field experiment in particular, the assignment was a adapted version of the dreaded disease assignment from Meyer and Keenan, I think 2008, I believe. And then the macro assignment was an adapted version of the Dal Duncan 2016 Periscope assignment. So it was, they were different assignments, they were different courses. And what was very interesting is that I taught the courses in 8-week sessions. And so micro was the first 8 weeks, and then macro was the second 8 weeks. So then there was a little bit of duplication in the students when you went across from the first 8 weeks to the second 8 weeks. And in the second 8 weeks, they became more critical of each other. Their peer evaluation got, I would say, more accurate, even though it went down in scores. So there's definitely a learning curve to how to peer evaluate, as well as how to orally communicate. So giving our students, I would say at least 2, maybe 3, depending upon your class, times a course, and then having it in multiple courses in a curriculum, which I know can be challenging. I am the econ department at my previous institution I was, and I am here as well. So it's a lot easier when I have full control over the entire department. I can decide when things go where, but it helps to have some of that consistency and that skill mastery, some scaffolding effect there. So the tasks I chose were ones that I already had in my course for the field experiment, but the rubric easily adapts to any group activity. Anytime students sit down and chat with each other, you can make this happen. I wouldn't necessarily say do it for every task or every group assignment, because then you might lose some of your fun factor in class. So that's why I say maybe only 2 or 3, depending upon your class. 2 would be plenty in my 8-week session, but maybe 3 in a 14-week, 16-week. So my tasks were ones that I already had. Your task can be any that you like.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the insights and the suggestions. Finally, one last question for Kripa, because we are a little bit out of time with respect to the schedule. This is about the ability to read. How the ability to read can help the ability to write, and how you can boost and foster the ability to read. Maybe Chelsea mentioned before a sort of peer exercise.
So when I first started with writing assignments, we did more reading-based assignments. So we would say, here's an article, and then tell us what do you think about the article, pick out arguments that you're for or against. And we found that critical reading was a huge problem for students. They just cannot critically read. So we tried to structure that by helping them, guiding them through reading exercises, what to do, how to do. And it just wasn't useful for the following reason, that in the first year, we talk about big ideas. In the second year, we teach them tools, and we say, here's a utility function, here's a budget constraint, now go optimize. They don't make the link between those tools and the reading. So we just completely scrapped the critical reading part from outside work, and we made it as, you design a problem that you do this particular task. But peer review turns out to be very useful for this. So they do the task, and then when they have to review their fellow students, they see that more critically than they see their own work. And that turns out to be a really good way to build critical reading skills. So taking a specific argument that they have thought about and tried to answer, and now giving someone else's perspective, that I found builds a lot more critical reading. That is harder to do without software. So we use Peer Scholar at the U of T. And it is fantastic in large courses because it does automatically reassigns one student's work to 3 other students, or how many ever you choose. They write it up, everything gets compiled and done electronically. I'm not sure how you would do this without technology, but in my experience, peer reviews for a specific thing help a lot. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question. But yeah, critical reading is a huge hole for students.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, unfortunately, we need to leave the Q&A session. And before leaving, let me thank all the participants to the conference and our wonderful presenters. And let me also remind you that there will be, sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. Yes, the TeachECONference will go on tomorrow as well. There will be day 2, and you should have received a link on your email, a Zoom link in your email. If you are following us on YouTube, it will be again the CTAL YouTube channel. So thanks a lot again, and now we can go to our breakout rooms. Thanks again, and see you tomorrow.
Well, goodbye. I'm going to head out.
I'd say, Maddie, do we just go?
I think we just leave.
Yes, I think so. Thank you for coming, and please join us for
tomorrow.
YouTube.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
See
you
you
very
tomorrow.
much. It's
Bye.
very interesting.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.